He came to honor the dead, a decorated black general standing among grieving families. But instead of respect, he was met with hate. A racist cop, fueled by prejudice, turned a sacred moment into a nightmare, drawing his gun in front of the crowd. In that instant, fear spread like wildfire, and silence fell over the funeral grounds. What followed was not only shocking, but it exposed the deep sickness hiding in plain sight. How could such cruelty happen in a place meant for peace? And what justice could possibly come from it? General Marcus Williams was a man defined by honor. A decorated military leader, he carried the weight of years of service, medals pinned to his chest, and scars both visible and unseen. To his community, he was more than a soldier. He was a symbol of strength, discipline, and dignity. Friends described him as calm, principled, the kind of man who stood tall no matter the storm. That day he wasn't on a battlefield. He wasn't leading troops or making history. He was simply a man in mourning, dressed in his formal uniform, standing at the funeral of a lifelong friend and fellow soldier. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with grief. Rows of folded flags and lowered heads painted a solemn picture. Yet beneath the silence, something darker stirred. The general's presence, his very identity, seemed to ignite a hidden fire in one man watching from the shadows, a local police officer whose prejudice blinded him to the uniform, the sacrifice, the humanity. For Marcus, this was supposed to be a day of respect, a day to say goodbye. But as he bowed his head in mourning, he had no idea that hatred was about to shatter the stillness of the funeral grounds. The calm before the storm was already breaking. The service had barely begun when the tension surfaced. General Marcus Williams stood in quiet reflection, his eyes fixed on the flag-draped coffin of his fallen comrade. For a moment, there was only silence, until the sharp crunch of boots broke the stillness. A police officer moved through the crowd, his stare locked not on the ceremony, but on Marcus. At first, people assumed it was routine, maybe security, but the way the officer's hand hovered near his holster told a different story. Whispers spread through the mourners as eyes shifted nervously. Marcus noticed it too, the glare, the suspicion, the silent challenge that seemed to strip away his decades of service. The officer called out, his voice harsh and cutting, questioning Marcus as if he were an intruder, not a grieving general in uniform. The crowd stiffened, shocked by the audacity. Yet Marcus, ever composed, tried to remain calm, answering with dignity. But dignity wasn't enough. In an instant, the officer's hostility escalated. He accused Marcus of being armed, of being a threat, his words dripping with venomous bias. Those nearby gasped, protesting, trying to reason with him. But reason was deafened by prejudice. The officer's hand went to his weapon, and before anyone could stop it, steel flashed in the open air. A gun, drawn, pointed, at a black general, in full uniform, at a funeral. Time seemed to freeze. Mothers clutched their children. Veterans in the crowd stood in disbelief. Marcus remained still, his heart pounding, but his posture unwavering. He had faced enemy fire in war zones across the world, but never had he expected the barrel of a gun to follow him home, to follow him to a place of mourning. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the officer barking threats. Every second dragged like an eternity, the crowd on edge, unsure whether they were about to witness tragedy. Some shouted for the officer to stop. Others pulled out phones recording the unthinkable. Marcus refused to flinch. He knew one sudden move could be his last. Yet behind his steady gaze, fear simmered. Fear not just for his life, but for what this moment revealed about the world he had dedicated his life to protect. And then it happened. The officer's finger tightened, his voice rising, spitting accusations louder and louder as if trying to justify the weapon in his hand. The line between restraint and disaster thinned to a thread. Each breath, Each heartbeat felt like the edge of an explosion. The funeral was no longer a place of mourning. It had become a battlefield. And the question hanging heavy in the air was chilling. Would hatred pull the trigger? The gun trembled in the officer's grip, his knuckles white, his rage boiling over. The crowd held its breath, dozens of eyes fixed on the unthinkable sight. A black general standing tall in his uniform, facing down the barrel of a gun on sacred ground. The air was thick with fear, heavy with disbelief. Children cried softly, parents pulled them close, veterans clenched their fists in silent outrage. Marcus didn't move. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to shout, to demand respect. But he knew one sudden move could end everything. His chest rose and fell with steady discipline, even as his heart pounded like a war drum. He had faced combat zones, stared death in the eye overseas, but nothing compared to this, the cold realization that in his own homeland, in his own uniform, he was still seen as nothing more than a target. The officer barked orders, his voice shaking with hatred, spitting accusations that made no sense. Threat, danger, words meant to justify what could never be justified. Phones recorded every second, capturing the madness for the world to see. Then the breaking point came. The officer's finger tightened on the trigger, his arm locking in place. Gasps erupted from the crowd, time fractured into fragments of terror. For a split second, it felt inevitable, the shot already echoing in people's minds. But Marcus stood rooted in defiance, his silence louder than any plea. His very stillness screamed a truth the officer could not erase, that no amount of hate could strip away his dignity. And in that unbearable moment, as the crowd braced for the worst, one thought pierced through every heart present. Would justice arrive in time, or would this funeral end with another grave? The crowd erupted before the trigger could fall. Voices rose in outrage, a wall of witnesses refusing to stay silent. Phones captured every angle, every second, and within minutes the world would see what happened in that cemetery. Other officers rushed forward, restraining their own colleague, tearing the weapon from his hands. The gun never fired, but the damage was already done. General Marcus Williams stood unshaken, his silence a symbol of defiance and strength. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out. He simply remained still, carrying the dignity that the uniform had always represented, something his attacker could never take away. That day, the officer was arrested, his actions impossible to excuse under the weight of so many witnesses and so much evidence. But for Marcus, justice wasn't victory, it was survival. He had walked into a funeral to honor the dead and nearly became one himself. The image of a gun pointed at him in front of mourners would haunt him long after the handcuffs clicked shut.